okay, I studied sculpture, and my ideas I'd get an idea for a form, and then I'd say, okay, how can I make this out of clay? But eventually that became kind of limiting because I wanted to do forms that were tall and skinny and kind of moving around in space, and when you try to do that out of clay, it's very difficult. You can do it. I did it for a long time, but it's so fragile I couldn't ship my work really at all. It would accidentally break in galleries sometimes just because people got too close, or one time a janitor knocked on with their broom. So I decided I need to look at some other materials, but also the change came when I had to move studios, and I didn't have a ceramic studio easily accessible, and I was working out of my home. I used to have a studio at the Currier Museum Art Center in Manchester for a very long time, maybe 10 years. So I needed something that I could do from home that wasn't as messy as clay, and that would allow me to create my forms in an even more exaggerated sense. And that's when I discovered fiber and felting. I had seen a fiber sculpture at the Sharon Arts Gallery, actually, many, many years ago, and it was in the back of my mind for a really long time, and so that was the first thing I needed to try, and then I was hooked right away. It was just exactly what I wanted to do. I could create any shape I wanted, and I could use any color that I wanted to. Another limitation with clay is that you have to add the glaze on later, and I wanted it to really be a part of the whole form. So this way I'm sculpting directly with the color that I want to use instead of having to put it on, not necessarily as an afterthought, but it just wasn't as purely a part of the form as the dyed wool is. So my work is very organic, and it usually starts with a plant that I've come across, either something I found at a walk at the beach, or I do a lot of hiking, backpacking up in the White Mountains, and I might find something that just really strikes my eye. And usually at the same time when I discover a new form that I like, it coincides with some kind of an emotion with me. So each of these pieces have something that I was thinking about at the time. Some not necessarily personal metaphors, a lot of them are, but some of them are just about relating human nature to organic and natural forms in general too. So each piece, it's hard to talk about them as a whole group because even though they are all one body of work, they are all very individual, and they come from very individual places and forms and concepts. So I think I'll talk about a few of the pieces individually, and if I don't get to one that you were hoping to hear more about, you can let me know too. So I'll start with the largest piece in the show. This is called Recession, and it is made out of, everything is needle felted or wet felted, and then inside of all of the parts is a stainless steel armature, so you can move them around and play with the way that they branch out. It's based on a fractal, and a fractal is one form that repeats infinitely, and it gets proportionately smaller or larger. So there's the one form with the large stem here, and then this peachy form here, and then it's repeated again, and then a third time. And I couldn't felt any smaller, so that was that was where I had to stop. And it took many, many, many hours, so mentally I needed to stop too. I don't know, maybe 80 hours, 80 to 100 hours went into that piece. Those of you that were just in my class know how long it takes. Do we have any needle felters or wet felters in the group? Anybody tried it? Okay, great. So you know how long. Yeah.
I mean, I just okay, never mind. Just once, a little bit, and I think that it's, anyway, so go on.
Yeah, afterwards I haven't cleaned up from the class. So I still have some things out and about. If you want to take a peek, that'd be fine while I finish cleaning. Yeah. So this piece is a lot about evolution and the way that things reproduce and then sometimes mutate. So there are 3 pieces that aren't the peach color. There are a reddish color with the peach dots, and it's how much, let's see, do I want to explain about it? Maybe I don't want to go too much into each piece. But I think a lot about the way that things grow and the way that things reproduce, and I'm really interested in the beginnings of life cycles. I think that has a lot to do with my love for gardening, and also I'm a mother too, so that is part of my reflections in my work as well. Let's see. So sometimes the pieces are a little bit less conceptual, but I'm just really awestruck by a particular form. And then sometimes the concept will come to me later. It can go either way. I can start with a concept and then create the form, or I might just make it and then about halfway through, then it will have a lot more meaning to me. It will become more personal to me. Let's see, which piece I'll talk about this one actually, since I'm right here. So this piece is a found brick. I found it at the ocean, so it's been tumbled around for a long time and it's very smooth. But I love how it's also made out of clay, but it's not something I've made myself. And I actually changed the title of this piece. It's taken some transformations to come here. It was called Microcosm, but I've added some other elements and it became something else. So it's called Conceal, and a lot of my work is about protection and protecting something that's fragile or delicate or rare, maybe endangered. So there's this form right here, and these, in my mind, these are kind of protecting it and keeping any predators away from it. And sometimes I'll find a brick, and there's a lot of, up north, a lot of bricks left over from when they had the logging operations going on. I think it was in the early 1800s. And that object will speak to me, and I'll just immediately think of things that are starting to grow out of it. But this piece also has to do with being very adaptive. I have a lot of pieces that have to do with being adaptive, like the shells are adaptive 1 is that one there, adaptive 2 and adaptive 3, and just the ability of plants to grow on sometimes almost nothing, like a brick. There are different kinds of lichen that can grow on rock or brick, and they don't need anything. They just live off the air and the moisture in the air, and then they start to grow these really amazing forms. And I think that's a really important skill to have, and not always easy to do, but something I think about a lot. The piece next to it is called Deep in the Quiet Woods, and I was thinking about meditation and Zen rock gardens. So the lines here are reminiscent of the way that they rake around the rocks, and I put it inside of a rock, so instead of it's kind of the opposite way. This piece is a clay form that I sculpted and then fired. It's unglazed, so this is just the raw clay color, and then the white wool inside of it. Let's see, I think this is one of my newer pieces over here. Can you guys hear me? I'm not a super loud talker, so okay, good. This piece over here is made out of wool and polymer clay, and even though these look really rigid and spiky, they are extremely flexible, so appearances can be deceiving. Polymer clay I have been working with for a long time, but I finally feel like I've mastered it because it's hard to make it so flexible without it breaking. But this piece is called Emerge, and it has to do with kind of breaking out of your shell and emerging into something else. And I feel like we have the power to do that on a daily basis, that we can reimagine ourselves and what we want to do all of the time, every day. I tell my kids every day is a new day. If they're not getting along or something, I'll say tomorrow's a new day. So that's kind of important for me personally. So a lot of my forms are emerging. I feel like we're always evolving and becoming. I'll leave it at that. Yeah. Let's see, this piece over here. So I've also been knitting for a really long time, but I haven't been knitting three-dimensional forms for a long time. So I have two pieces that have been knit, and I'm really into the process. It's a lot more technical. It's very mathematical. I make my own patterns, so that takes me a while to figure out how many stitches and how to go in and out. But this piece it's inspired by a book by Robin Wall Kimmerer. I don't know if anybody's heard of her. It's called Braiding Sweetgrass. It's one of my favorite books, and the title of this is Papawi, and it's the force which causes mushrooms to push up from the earth overnight. And that power is just so incredible. So I have 3 different mushroom forms at different stages. There's so much energy in mushrooms because they just amazingly sprout up. Last summer we were backpacking and we stayed at the same place for 3 nights, and when we got there was little tiny mushrooms, and by the time we left they were gigantic. They're huge, almost maybe the biggest ones I'd ever seen. So I wanted to capture that, and also that energy, that force that they have. A lot of my pieces are inspired by books and things that I read. I like to read different books by naturalists. This piece was also inspired by a book called Entangled Life. It's about mushrooms and mostly mycelium, but how everything is connected underground, how the mycelium connects the trees and the plants and all of the living organisms in the ground. And it was also inspired by a painting by Hilma af Klint. Has anybody heard of her? She was a Swedish painter. Really interesting story. We just sort of recently discovered her work, even though it's 100 years old. But she decided she didn't want anyone to see her work until people would be more accepting of it. Because at her time, modern abstract painting it didn't happen, and she was a woman. So she they think might be the first abstract painter ever. But her work is very inspirational, and her ideas are kind of in line with a lot of the things that I think about as well, the way that things are connected, the way people are connected and connected to nature as well. Yes. Yeah, Hilma, Hilma, Af, A-F, and then Klimt, Klimt. Yeah, really amazing painter. If you haven't heard of her, you should check her out.
Was this the artist that had the big show at the Doodle?
Yes.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That was a turning point, just even thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's interesting, in the newspaper article they wrote about the show, they also mentioned Georgia O'Keeffe, who was one of my first, really early high school inspirations. So I also like her work too. And I like how Georgia O'Keeffe zooms in so that you can't immediately tell. Sometimes you can, but I really am attracted to her works where you don't know exactly what flower it is or what the bones are from. One of my favorite things when I was a child, I think it was in Ranger Rick magazine, it was this grid of photographs, and they were really close up, and you had to guess what the object came from, what it was. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? These really close-up photographs? Yeah, that was my favorite. I looked forward to that magazine so I could see, and they'd be, so zoomed in. And that's how I work. I'm not inspired by a whole object usually. I'm inspired by one, like the way one petal connects to the stem. That really kind of macro connection is what gets me really excited. So let's see, where should I talk about next? This piece also took a lot of different transformations. When I originally touched it, or I was going to say, can I touch it? But I'm going to. When I originally felted it, I created it like this. It didn't have the bottom part here. It was like this. And it just wasn't satisfying me. It wasn't enough. So then I flipped it over and I started ripping the wool out. And I was like attacking it with scissors and pulling it. And then it all of a sudden just made sense all of a sudden. So then I started focusing on the interior. Oh, sure.
Oh, okay.
There.
So you said you pulled the, it's not Rachel.
Yes.
It is Rachel. I know. You started pulling the wool out. Was the pink already in there?
No, it was all white. Yes. Yep.
Is there an armature in that?
No, it was a ton of wool. It was solid wool. It was a piece of wool like this big to create that. And I make each piece, well, actually with this one, I made each piece directly on it and went around and then made them slowly bigger. And these, I went from small to large. I'll deal with you later. This piece over here is a similar form, but I sculpted them all individually and then they are sewn on. When you're felting, if you felt it really, really hard, then it won't felt onto another hard felted piece. So when I am in that situation, I'll sew to put the parts together. It's way over here, the white. Oh, this piece here.
Can we come up closer?
Yes, yes. So I'll bring it over, but it's also good to come closer to see.
Screams when you walk. That's true. Like just
Oh.
walk back and then you talk.
Are you allowed to touch it?
I don't know. So this piece is called Ascend, and this piece is also about capturing that sense of energy that new forms have when they're first emerging. And the repetition of the same shape just seems to build up that energy for me. And again, it's this little soft form being protected by all of these outer pieces around it. And even though they are soft themselves, there's so many of them, it's kind of strength in numbers around this little part here. This is one of my earlier pieces. I've only been felting for 5 years. So this is 3 years old. The first year, none of those pieces I would ever show. I had to really investigate the materials first. Is there a particular piece that anybody would like me to talk about next? I won't have time to talk about all of them, but I can also take any questions too.
Okay, the one on the wall.
Yeah, so that one is inspired by all of the growths that you see on trees. There's plant growths, but there's also insect webs and insect eggs. I love eggs of all kinds. I love finding frog eggs in the spring. I know you're not really supposed to touch them, but sometimes I'll pick them up in the water and they're just really amazing. And so that was really fun, felting around the actual wood. I had to be careful. I broke some needles as I tried to poke into it with the wood inside of it. But that led to these too. That's kind of the process behind those. These are called nests, and these are actually wearable, or you could hang them as well. But to me, nests mean a lot of different things. They're a really nurturing place, but they could also be a restrictive place. So with these, it's more on the restrictive side. They're growing and they're getting larger and they're ready to leave the nest, but they're kind of being held back at the same time. Any other particular piece?
I'm really interested in the duality of materials with your ceramics and the felt combined, and the rocks. I think it's just a really neat combination of soft and hard. I'm curious to see how it evolves, because it already is starting to evolve with the kind of oozing out and leaking over stuff. Is that something that you're moving more towards now, like chronologically in the pieces? Is that?
Yes, yeah. These are the newest pieces here, and I am in the process of making a really large one. I've made the clay form. It's drying, so next week I can felt inside of it. But yeah, that is where I'm going. I still love clay so much, and there's a reason I use clay, not just because I love the way that it feels, but it also conceptually has a lot of power to it too, that it came from the earth itself, and how it goes from being a soft material to a really hard material. And then the contrast with the soft fiber is something I really love. The piece with the brown stoneware, that piece is called Soft Spots, and it relates to a lot of different things. But just that vulnerability that we can experience, and that shell we can put around ourselves, and that also has to do with protection. And I think as a mother, I think about protecting a lot.
With that piece, was that something you had the concept for and then worked it out, or worked out the concept as you went?
That piece, I had it entirely in my head before I started. And for the clay pieces, I tend to work that way because I have to make it and then fire it, and then I'll felt into it. And sometimes I'll do that and I'll be like, no, not quite right, so I have to make another piece and then fire it. Whereas the felt, I can start ripping. It's a lot more forgivable. But yeah, I think about the clay first, and then sometimes when I'm felting, I work really intuitively, but I have years and years and years of gathering references, so I'm not just randomly imagining all these forms. I've been studying them. I have a macro lens on my camera, and so I take really, really close up. It's very long. It has all these extensions, so I love photography too. And I've been gardening since I was maybe 16. I've had my own garden. I started and worked on a lot of farms when I was in college, just always growing things. And then in the winter, I grow these sculptures. Yeah. Same, it's kind of inverted on this piece over here. The soft part is on the outside. So just exploring, I think this one came after. This was one of the first pieces I made with clay and fiber. And then there's this piece. This is inspired by puffball mushrooms. This particular glaze is a satin white glaze, and it looks really soft. So even though it's a hard material, it's that piece isn't about protection or vulnerability. It's about the softness and suppleness of the materials and objects in nature. Let's see, how are we for time? I have no idea.
It's 4:30.
Oh, okay. Maybe I'll talk about this piece over here. So this piece is called Heirloom, and it's inspired by a pea pod, and I made a little tiny pea pod, and then I decided I would make a really large one. And when I made this part first, and everyone kept saying, "Are you making a little baby elf hat?" What is this? But it was a lot of fun, and as I was doing it, I was thinking a lot about knitting and knitting traditions, and I learned to knit from my grandmother when I was, I don't know, maybe eight or nine, and how things are passed down, not just objects, but also techniques. So the title for this piece came later after those reflections. This is called Heirloom. And it also ties into my love for growing vegetables and heirloom vegetables as well. So that piece was a labor of love. It took a very long time, a very tiny size 2 knitting needles. But while I'm working, everything I do is extremely time extensive, and it helps me to work out what I'm actually doing, and I have a lot of reflecting time as I'm spending hours poking or knitting. It's very meditative for me, and that's a part of it for sure. Yes?
This is a very plebeian question, but I've heard a little bit about how felting is done. I don't really understand it very well, but the whole concept makes my hands ache. So how do you manage that?
Well, I don't do it 8 hours a day. So, do you mean like physically? How do I? Yeah. I teach a lot.
Can you describe it a little bit, what you physically do?
Yeah, so you take big pieces of puffy wool and you roll it up to start, and then you poke it with a barbed needle. They're about this long. And as you poke it, it condenses the wool fibers, and it shrinks and shrinks and shrinks. So you build up layers as you go. But it's millions of little stabs. So I do it 20 minutes here, 20 minutes there, an hour here. Eventually, when I was coming close to having to bring my work here, I was doing like 8 hours. But I teach a lot, and so I can't just do it all day. But it's a lot of people, like art teachers, say, "How do you make so much work and teach?" But it's how I relax. So it works out for me. Not all techniques are relaxing and meditative, so then it's a little more difficult. But to me, I can do it anytime. I don't have to prepare mentally. I can just do 20 minutes, go to work, come home, do a couple of hours. I can do it before bed, although sometimes I get excited and have to keep coming downstairs to draw on my sketchbook because when I work right up until when I go to sleep, I'm thinking a lot. But sometimes I just let that happen because I can get my best ideas that way. Yeah.
Is there a reason why you gravitate towards like white and pinks and peachy colors?
Oh, what a really good question. Yeah. So when I was in graduate school and I was making organic forms out of clay, my professors were asking me, "What are these all about? Like, why are you making these?" That's what grad school is. They just ask you that over and over and over. And I kept coming back to relating them to myself and to my body. And so they made me think about how I can do that through color. And by really paring down the colors, I think you can imagine all kinds of different situations when there's a lack of color. But also having everything being kind of at the beginning of a life cycle, I chose white to represent all of these beginnings in my work. And then the pink, I needed another color to contrast with white. And at the time I was doing this with glazes when I first started using white and pink. But I've been doing this color scheme for a really long time. Let's see, 15, 17 years maybe. I'm working white with a little pink. But my newer pieces have a lot more color. lately. I'm not sure. I haven't worked that out yet, but I still go back to white, and the pink is also a beginning life color, but it's a feminine color, but I don't really like to say that because I think that everyone can like pink and what we consider feminine colors. It's not necessarily to indicate a womanly presence. And sometimes I just, like this piece here is based off of a lady slipper, which is this color. And I remember when I was a kid, they were extremely endangered. Couldn't touch them or pick them up, but they're so amazing. So I always wanted to, but I left them alone. And now when I go for hikes, they're all over the place. So that's really, really exciting. But I have, I also am inspired by the Shakers a little bit and their minimalist aesthetic. I have a watercolor by a Shaker hanging on my wall in outside of my bathroom, and I look at it every day, and it came out in this piece. So, yeah. Oh, really good question. Thank you.
When you squint in a room that's all white, things are like floating around like the seeds.
Oh.
Or something that's undefined, it's not so physical.
Yes.
And in a different setting, you wouldn't see that, but I've been doing this, and I kind of like it. It's like the color is dancing in space, it's floating.
Oh, wow.
Because of the way its context.
What a great perspective, yeah.
And this one especially, because it also has a shadow. It's
yes.
all dimensions of what we'd call a spirit, or
Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah.
And this space
Thank
is
you.
great. Glad you did it.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I had a solo exhibition a couple of years ago, and they wanted the walls dark for my white work, and I was like, it doesn't look right. It was dark gray walls, and I love the white pedestals. And the windows are perfect. Yeah, absolutely.
Because this piece and this, you know, it begins to go away from us into the world and have its own relationship in space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like everything that you said, but I also like how you pointed out the shadows and how it kind of has a spirit. I try to make things so we recognize parts of them, but so that we don't recognize other parts of them, so that we can have a connection, but we have to explore the connection